Picture this: a queen, once worshipped as a goddess, now reduced to a walking corpse. Her skin, once powdered snow white, has begun to crack and slough off, the thick lead paint seeping poison into her flesh. The stench of rot and sour pus clings to her like a cloak. Her teeth, blackened stumps, ooze blood when she tries to speak. Every breath rattles, bubbling through the infection, festering in her swollen throat. This is not myth. This is how England's greatest monarch died. She was a creature of horror. Her courtiers watched her shrink into a skeleton, her eyes sunken, her lips cracked and oozing. And when she forced herself upright, refusing to lie down for fear that she'd never rise again, fluids leaked from her sores and dripped onto the palace floor, leaving dark stains her maids could never scrub away. But death would not come quickly. No, it toyed with her. For weeks, she hovered in the twilight between life and the grave. And in that limbo, she became something monstrous. Some swore that when she finally died, her body filled with such foul gas that her coffin burst apart, spewing a black, reeking fluid into the royal chamber. Others whispered that the wax effigy of her corpse began to melt, its face sagging in the candlelight, as though the queen was rotting a second time for all to see. This is the grotesque, gory death of Queen Elizabeth I, the monarch who turned into a nightmare before the eyes of her court. By the winter of 1603, Richmond Palace reeked of sickness. The air was heavy with the sour stench of sweat, rotting flesh, and the metallic tang of blood. Elizabeth, once the dazzling virgin queen, now looked like death stuffed into royal silks. Her face, the mask that had ruled England, was smeared in a thick inch of white lead makeup. But beneath it, her skin was splitting and weeping. Yellow pus oozed from cracks where the paint had eaten through to raw flesh. Courtiers whispered that her own beauty routine had poisoned her, that the spirits of Saturn in her cosmetics were eating her alive from the outside in. Her mouth was worse. When she tried to speak, her teeth, blackened, rotting stumps, wobbled in her gums. Blood and pus bubbled between them, dripping down her chin in red-black rivulets. Attendants reported that when she smiled, on the rare occasion she tried, the sight was more terrifying than any grimace of pain. And her throat, her once proud voice, was strangled by a swelling abscess deep in her neck. The flesh ballooned grotesquely, the veins pulsing like worms beneath her skin. When she coughed, attendants heard the wet, bubbling sound of trapped fluid. Sometimes she hacked so violently that chunks of phlegm streaked with blood splattered across the palace floor. Still, Elizabeth refused doctors. She would not be touched, would not be examined, would not be seen as weak. Instead, she staggered through her chamber, refusing to lie down. She would stand for hours, trembling, her long nails digging bloody crescents into the tapestries she clutched for balance. When exhaustion overtook her, she collapsed onto the cushions her ladies had strewn across the floor. And there she would lie, gasping, her body leaking sweat pus and blood, soaking the fabrics until the stink of infection became unbearable. One maid wrote that at night, when the chamber was still, you could hear her body whistling as she breathed, the sound of air forcing its way past the swelling in her throat, bubbling through infected fluid. To the terrified courtiers, it sounded less like breath and more like the last gurgles of a drowning woman. The Queen of England was rotting alive before their eyes. As her body decayed, Elizabeth's mind began to rot with it. Richmond Palace became a haunted house, echoing not just with coughs and wheezes, but with her screams in the night. She refused to sleep in her bed. "If I lie down, I will never rise again," she whispered. And so she wandered the palace corridors, a shuffling skeleton draped in soiled silks, eyes bloodshot and wild. Her ladies spread cushions across the cold wooden floors, hoping she might collapse on them instead of cracking her bones. But rest never brought peace. The Queen was haunted. She began to see the dead. One night, attendants found her shrieking in the dark, clawing at the walls. She swore she saw Mary, Queen of Scots, standing in the corner, her cousin, whom Elizabeth had ordered beheaded years before. In her vision, Mary's headless body gushed blood across the chamber floor, the stump of her neck spurting and soaking the Queen's slippers. Elizabeth fell to her knees, hands slick with imaginary gore, begging Mary's ghost to forgive her. Another night, she gasped that she saw her own mother, Anne Boleyn, executed by Henry VIII. Anne's pale, ghostly face floated before her, lips moving soundlessly, eyes dripping black ichor like tar. Elizabeth screamed until her throat swelled so badly that blood actually spilled from the corners of her mouth, dripping onto her gown. And then came the worms. In her fever dreams, Elizabeth would tear at her own skin, shrieking that worms were crawling under her flesh. Maids found her scratching until her fingernails snapped, leaving bloody grooves down her arms. Once, she dug at her face so furiously that chunks of her lead paint makeup came off smeared with blood and yellow pus, clinging to her hands like wet plaster. "They are eating me alive," she screamed, eyes rolling back as if she could actually feel the maggots feasting beneath her skin. By day, she was no calmer. She stared for hours at shadows in the corners, muttering that they were watching her. A card pierced by a nail was found on her chair. "A cursed omen," they whispered, and Elizabeth became convinced someone had bewitched her. When her coronation ring was finally pried from her swollen, decaying finger, she wailed like a dying animal, shrieking that her soul had been torn out with it. Within days, she was a husk. The Queen was no longer ruling. She was rotting and raving. And still, death held back as if savoring every last scream. By late March 1603, Elizabeth could no longer speak. She sat slumped on the palace floor, wrapped in filthy cushions soaked with sweat and pus. Her throat bulged grotesquely, the abscess inside now so swollen that every gurgling breath sounded like she was drowning. The smell of rot filled the chamber, sweet, sickly, metallic, a stench that made even hardened courtiers gag. The Archbishop of Canterbury knelt beside her, whispering prayers. But Elizabeth wasn't listening. Her lips trembled, froth bubbling at the corners. Her eyes rolled wildly, staring at horrors only she could see. She raised a trembling hand as if to crown an unseen figure, her final signal that James of Scotland was to succeed her. And then her body gave way. Her throat burst. With a wet, tearing sound, the abscess in her neck split open, spraying a gout of yellow-green pus and dark, clotted blood down her chest. Courtiers screamed as the Queen's silk shift was instantly soaked through, the foul liquid dripping onto the cushions and pooling on the floor. She convulsed violently, hacking and gagging as more infected fluid poured from her mouth and nose. Her blackened teeth rattled loose, one falling free and landing with a bloody splat on the wood beside her. Her body shook, heels drumming the floor, nails clawing deep, bloody grooves into the cushions. The once golden Virgin Queen was now choking to death on her own rot. Her attendants tried to hold her upright, but every breath sprayed flecks of blood across their faces. One maid fainted outright, collapsing into the puddle of pus spreading beneath the queen. The sound was unbearable, a wet, gurgling rattle, each exhale weaker than the last, until finally her head lolled to the side, eyes staring glassy and lifeless. A final trickle of dark blood slid from her lips and down her chin, dripping into the pool of filth that had once been inside her. At the stroke of midnight, March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor was dead. The Virgin Queen, who had ruled for nearly half a century, ended her reign in a pool of her own blood and pus. But her horror didn't end there. In death, her body became even more grotesque. Death should have brought peace, but for Elizabeth, it only made her body more monstrous. Her ladies-in-waiting, trembling with fear, stripped her foul-soaked gown away and prepared her corpse for burial. But the moment they uncovered her, the chamber filled with a wave of putrid stench. Her belly had already begun to swell, skin stretching tight and shiny as gases of decomposition churned inside. Her once proud throat, the site of her fatal rupture, had turned black and collapsed inward, a jagged hole crusted with dried pus and congealed blood. They packed her in spices, herbs, and perfumes, but it was useless. The smell of sweet rot, bile, and feces oozed from her body. Her fingernails had already begun to turn blue, her lips purple. The coronation ring, which had fused into her flesh over decades, had to be pried from her swollen finger with force, tearing away strips of grey, peeling skin. Finally, they sealed her in a heavy lead coffin, hoping to contain the horror inside. But it didn't work. Within days, the body swelled to bursting. Gases built inside her until the coffin itself began to groan and bulge. Guards swore they heard a sound like muffled thunder from within, the Queen's corpse straining against its prison. Then, with a sickening crack, the coffin split open. What came out was unspeakable. Witnesses described a torrent of black, stinking liquid spilling from the seam, a mixture of blood, liquefied organs, and putrefying flesh. The air turned so foul that even hardened yeomen vomited where they stood. One fainted outright, collapsing into the spreading puddle of ichor on the stone floor. Elizabeth Southwell, one of her ladies, later whispered that the Queen's body had exploded in the coffin, her bloated flesh tearing apart under the pressure of decay. Whether truth or rumor, the tale spread like wildfire. The mighty Virgin Queen, bursting like a rotting carcass, fouling the palace with her death stench. To hide the horror, attendants placed a wax effigy of Elizabeth atop the coffin, a perfect replica, painted as if still alive, crowned and robed in purple. But even this image betrayed them. Under the heat of funeral candles, the wax began to sag and melt, its face dripping downwards, pale streaks of wax sliding like flesh peeling from bone. Mourners gasped in terror. To them, it seemed that Elizabeth was rotting a second time before their eyes. Even in death, the Virgin Queen refused to rest quietly. Her corpse was a nightmare, one last grotesque reign of horror over her kingdom. And so ended the reign of Elizabeth Tudor, not with glory, but with gore. But perhaps the greatest horror was the look on her people's faces. They had adored her, for 45 years. Now, in her final procession, they gagged at the reek of her decay. They cried out not just in grief, but in disgust. For the Virgin Queen had become something else, a walking, rotting reminder that no crown, no power, no glory can escape death's corruption. Even centuries later, stories of her demise are whispered like ghost tales. Whether legend or truth, one thing is certain. Elizabeth I left the world in a spectacle of horror that even Shakespeare could not have imagined. So the next time you see her portraits, the proud Virgin Queen in glittering silks, pale face shining like marble, remember the truth. Behind the paint, behind the crown, behind the myth, was a woman who died, rotting, bursting, and bleeding like any mortal. And her last gift to history? A death so grotesque, it still reeks across the centuries. This has been the gory, horrifying death of Elizabeth I. If you want more tales of history's darkest, bloodiest ends, you know where to find us.